Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you find yourself. Welcome to the business case for 100% supplier e-invoicing. This is a trade shift webinar, and if any of those words out of my mouth were confusing to you, it's possible you're in the wrong place. But if not, if what you want to do is be part of a conversation, be part of a dialogue around suppliers, supplier onboarding, e-invoicing, how to maximize the value driver that is digital transformation, then stick around. This is exactly where you should be. We've got the next hour, I believe. My name is Rowan Lemley, and I can see that my name isn't perfectly written there. It doesn't matter. My ego doesn't need it. So needless to say, I am the Director of Product Marketing here at TradeShift, and I'm joined by Michael Creedon, who is our Solution Consulting Manager here at TradeShift and the true subject matter expert. And at least you can read his name so that when you write questions into the chat box, you can reference one of us or the other. And just before I jump into the agenda, a small bit of housekeeping. We can make this as interactive as you want. We don't have any poll questions. Apparently the polls indicate that people hate poll questions sometimes. So anyways, what we'd like to do is encourage you to spontaneously write in any question or comment. Part of my role will be to interject those, if I possibly can, into the conversation with Mike. And I can definitely guarantee you that if you ask a question and we don't answer it in this webinar, then we will reach out to you directly and answer it directly. Now, yes, you will get a recording of this email or webinar in your inboxes later today or tomorrow. And yeah, like I said, join the conversation. I'll be monitoring the questions. Here's our agenda for the day. I'm going to do a short little intro of TradeShift. If you don't know TradeShift, super tight. And then, as you can see, we're going to hit some really big subjects around the global supply chain shifts, the state of AP today. We'll talk about digital transformations, why they struggle. We'll put some data points in front of you. Then we'll get into supplier engagement specifically, and we'll try to outline some of those best practices that we've learned over the last 14, 15. In fact, I've been in the industry longer than that, but basically over the last decade and a half. And then we'll summarize with the business impact of those best practices. And like I said, join the conversation if you want. Let's jump into it. So, super quick intro. If you don't know us, we are the Business Network. We were a business network before we got into accounts payable automation, purchase to pay, and all the wonderful fintech things that I'll introduce you in our next slide. We've got some great logos, as you can see there. Lots more too. The network is global. Right now, we're pulling in invoices from 190 plus countries all over the world. Pretty exciting. 2.9 million connections. That's the network itself. And quite a few transactions as well. And of course, it's growing all the time with every one of our customers and their suppliers. Lots of activity in this space. And it's not just about accounts payable automation or suppliers sending invoices. We've got a whole portfolio of solutions that are available on this network. E-invoicing, of course, we're going to talk about that today. We're also going to talk about the collaboration and onboarding that's part of what it means to be in a business network. And this is onboarding suppliers. This is onboarding customers. It's really one of the things that sets us apart in terms of making our network truly accessible, but obviously a huge value driver too for things like accounts payable automation, which we'll spend most of our time with today. We also have virtual credit cards for spend management and B2B marketplaces, which is kind of like the most futuristic way you could look at e-procurement. And it's not like we're light years ahead of the game. We're really just taking the B2C lessons learned, like the success of Amazon business, for example, or Amazon for that matter, and we're applying it to the B2B world. So if that's something that's interesting to you, hit us up and we'd love to talk to you about it. Supplier financing. This is, of course, all about helping cash move faster through the supply chain in order to give companies more opportunity to leverage their cash flows, optimize their cash flows, etc. Primarily, we're talking about receivables financing here, but as we work with HSBC, which is a key partner of ours, there will be more fintech opportunities available through the network. So that's you at the middle of our portfolio. If you want it to be, feel free to reach out. All right, I'm done plugging the company. Mike, give them the goods.
Great. Thank you, Rowan, and appreciate everybody's attendance in this webinar today. If you've lived or worked in the last 3 to 5 years anywhere in the world, right, you know that from a personal and a professional standpoint, we've all faced, frankly, enormous challenges every day in today's environment, and professionally speaking, within the supply chain, right? There have been seismic challenges, right, for businesses to adapt to. And one of those impacts of that change is almost what I would refer to as supplier upheaval, right? And this is data that's coming directly from the Tradeshift network, where gone are the days where 80 to 90% of an enterprise's supply chain are constant suppliers from year to year, right? Because of all the changes taking place, we're now at a point where, according to our data, just under 65% of suppliers from year to year are constant, but another 20% of supply base is new. And then somewhat alarming is 15 to 16% of the supply base is churn, right? And the reality is that this is driving a significant amount of change in the way that B2B commerce and invoice transactions are taking place. And the World Economic Forum, right, from Davos from last January, sort of agree with this seismic shift in the supply chain and understand and have promoted the need to stimulate and sustain supply chain resilience in order to improve global trade. And they really laid out 3 key elements or points to help enterprises build their supply chain resilience. And in no particular order, one was to support the WTO, right? One was to modernize trading infrastructure. And the third, again, in no particular order, was boosting digital accountability. And I'm going to read a specific quote from the WEF's report, which is a great example of working together towards trade transformation is the Single Window Initiative, which is essentially connecting trading partners, in a centralized fashion, provided by the World Bank Group with funding from the Trade Facilitation Support Program. And this is the most important part. This initiative serves as a path for paperless trade. Why do I bring this quote up? Because this is effectively what Tradeshift was built for, right? To provide our customers and their supply chain with a clear digital path to paperless trade. And most companies today sort of, understand that call to action that the WEF promoted back in January of last year. And it's why the majority of companies today are trying their best to prioritize digital transformation. But 85% of global trade remains digitally disconnected. And in a weird way, that statement is funny because companies in our space, in the Tradeshift space, really have been predicting the end of paper or the end of manual processes and or a huge shift towards everybody becoming digital forever. But it hasn't exactly happened the way we all expected it to. And there's evidence from different analysts and different publications to suggest that projects have good intentions, but often fail, right? And the issue is figuring out why, right? McKinsey, a couple of years ago, suggested that 2 out of every 3 projects related to digital transformation fail to hit their stated objectives. And Forbes from the same year goes even a step further and suggests that almost 3 out of every 4 supply chain projects fail because of poor supplier and user adoption. So can we agree, or does this suggest that too many projects lose sight of the impact to the supplier or on the supplier, and or how critical suppliers are to transformational success? But if we can agree that that's a potential takeaway from these nuggets, then why is the supplier always the forgotten part of this equation? Suppliers often remain digitally disconnected from their customers, and it's clearly impacting account payable teams and hindering potential efficiency gains. Anecdotally, and through data, which I'll share in a minute from an analyst, there's still too many supplier inquiries coming in via out of band methods, emails, phone calls, voicemails, right? There's still thousands of suppliers and their underlying data for AP teams to update in a variety of systems that are typically in their own silos. There's still a tremendous amount of manual processing, inefficient exception handling that is plaguing AP, who's trying their best to resolve broken or inefficient channels. But all of these are tremendously ineffective on promoting digital transformation, getting to those KPIs, and getting some kind of return on investment from either existing solutions or solutions that enterprises are evaluating in the future. Now, Rowan, I'm curious to get your take on this, outside of sort of generic supplier disconnection, right?
Mm.
Either anecdotally or through talking to customers, what are you hearing in terms of what else is hurting, invoice automation initiatives, or what's hurting accounts payable best practices, in your mind, in your world?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think you know, I feel like to start with, I think we have to be honest. We're in this industry for some years, and we're obviously not the only company in this industry, but essentially most of our competitors have what they call and what analysts call supplier networks. And it's a misnomer because everything that these companies do is buyer centric. So we design solutions. The industry has built solutions around the large customer, and the suppliers are essentially needed, but not necessarily favored, so to speak. So I think that's a starting point that we can all admit is that these networks and the solutions that we're building, and I'm going to give you the Tradeshift example in a second, but the networks and the solutions that we're building in the industry are buyer centric and not supplier centric. Now, Tradeshift, from its inception, was in fact a supplier centric solution. The solution was built up to make it easier for suppliers to, in fact, send invoices electronically to their customers. And so I do think, Tradeshift specifically has a different relationship with suppliers. We view suppliers equally to buyers, and I think that's important. But the only other thing I would add to what you've already got here and what I know you're going to probably talk about is data quality. Invoice data quality is a big issue for buyers specifically, and even in a world where, say, Europe pushes various centralized invoice compliance processes like the clearance model, you've still got data quality being an issue and data enrichment. And how do we do it? Do we do data enrichment on the supplier side or on the buyer side? And these are things that do come up. So there is a disconnect. AP may still be drowning a little bit, but suppliers are having a hard time of it too. There you
I
go.
appreciate the color, and it's a great segue, frankly, into some of what we'll talk about in a minute around, kind of putting the supplier in some ways first in the evaluation of these types of technology solutions, or in your approach to getting supplier buy-in to help with optimal levels of e-invoicing. And frankly, analysts tend to agree with what some of the larger issues are in invoicing and AP. Last year, Ardent Partners put out a report called AP Metrics That Matter, and some of they surveyed enterprise companies to get a sense of what their biggest issues are in invoicing and AP. And these shouldn't come as a shock to anybody, right? These are kind of always the usual suspects, it seems like, year in and year out, which are things like invoice and payment approvals taking too long, right? Also a high percentage of invoice exceptions, right? Followed then by things like late supplier payments, which clearly negatively impact overall buyer-supplier relationships. And then clearly, with all of the late and delayed approvals, the exceptions, the late payments, right, that's just going to drive the cost of internal AP processing through the roof. And the interesting part of these survey results is that all of these typically come from the same root causes, right? Too much paper-based invoice receipt, or at the very least, a lack of standardization in terms of how invoices are coming in to the organization, right? Decentralized processes, right? Maybe you do have a way to have suppliers submit invoices, but are falling short in terms of giving visibility to the suppliers once that delivery happens, right? The visibility in terms of seeing where invoices are in the process, being able to allow suppliers to, in a self-service fashion, request status of payments, see status of payments without making a request, right? All of those processes typically, are decentralized, right? We talked a little bit earlier about general supplier disconnection, right? When solutions don't provide a B2B network and it's more of a point-to-point solution, it can be harder for suppliers to get the information they need, and harder for them to see the overall value that these types of solutions can really provide to their own business dealings. And then ERP integration, right? Not every supplier is going to be further along enough in their technology to integrate with every single technology system out there. So it's really critical for companies like Tradeshift to make it easier for suppliers to deliver invoices regardless of what their technical aptitude is, regardless of what their infrastructure is, right? We don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to what suppliers can send what types of invoices. We really try to provide a flexibility to get the most amount of suppliers to participate in this digital transformation journey. And I'll get into the meat or the specifics of what that looks like in a second. So the other thing that came out of this Ardent Partners report last year was those surveyed indicated what items or what invoice and AP elements were on their agenda for the year, right? And the items themselves are spot on, right? If you look at the feedback from those surveyed, it's improving data analytics, improving AP automation capabilities, reducing paper and eliminating manual tasks, and then getting more suppliers to submit digital invoices. But when Rowan and I and others at Tradeshift looked at this report, there was one thing that stuck out to us that didn't sit right, which is while the elements of the agenda are perfectly fine and spot on, how they're weighted is not ideal, right? There's no way you can hyper focus on data analytics before enabling your suppliers to submit cleaner invoices, right? It's that whole garbage in, garbage out, metaphor, right? There's no way to improve these data analytics processing without getting more suppliers to submit cleaner invoices. So at Tradeshift, we have a different view, not of what the agenda should be or what it should include, but how it should be prioritized, right? Start with digitizing your supply chain, providing mechanisms for suppliers to submit invoices in different ways, but standardize that receipt into digital format, which will allow you as an organization to reduce the paper volume and ultimately reduce the underlying manual tasks that paper-based receipt creates, right? And that allows for a creation of a foundation for accounts payable automation, leveraging things like machine learning, leveraging things like artificial intelligence, leveraging things like better invoice matching algorithms. And then by putting in those steps above, you can do a better job ensuring that the quality output in terms of data and in analytics is cleaner because you put in the time up front, sort of more of the upstream processes within AP to get where you're looking for, out of your ERP system, out of your BI tools, et cetera, et cetera.
Michael, I got a question from the audience.
Yeah, sure.
It's a quick one. Do you consider a PDF document in an invoice to be an electronic invoice?
It's a good question and timely because in about one slide, I'll talk
Oh,
about the different methods we have to capture different types of supplier invoices, right? And understanding that as companies start to implement these solutions, right, it's not going to be 100% digital on the first day, right? The goal is to get there, right? But understanding that there'll be some volumes of invoices that may still be paper, that may still be image PDF, that may be electronic PDF. And we'll talk in a minute about how Tradeshift addresses this, this disparity and how invoices are received and how ultimately we work with our buying organizations and with their supply base to start standardizing how these invoices are received inside of the network. Just prior to that, though, how does Tradeshift aim to deal with these AP agenda items? And it goes back to this whole supplier first methodology. We firmly believe at Tradeshift, we want to prioritize supplier needs. And as a result, we are going to create value for everybody else. And what does prioritizing supplier needs mean, right, from our standpoint? It means activating and engaging with suppliers when there's a need for them to engage with you, right? Providing easy mechanisms for the suppliers to communicate, easy mechanisms for suppliers to join a network like Tradeshift, easy mechanisms for them to start transacting. And it leads to sort of my second point, which is around you have to provide immediate value to suppliers through a first touch point, right? Far too often when technology companies roll out their solution for an organization, they'll get a supplier to join, but then the supplier says, wait a second, like, where's the value, right? Is all I have at my disposal here just a way to send an invoice and then I have no other visibility or insight, right? That's not valuable enough for me to make a change. So it's all about educating the supply base on what the values are, delivering immediate value in first touch points, which will ensure solutions, what I call stickiness, ensure that the supplier, when they join and when they start transacting with you through a new piece of technology, there's a sustainability factor about it, that they're not just going to join and jump out a week later, right? That they find new and exciting things to do within the solution to help grow their own business, right? And because we're a network, also providing the facility for suppliers to connect with more and more and more and more of their customer base exponentially, which doesn't exist in a point-to-point solution. And to the webinar participants' question a minute ago, ensure that invoice delivery is simple and intuitive with little to no barriers to adoption. And that goes back to understanding that not every supplier can deliver an invoice with the same amount of data the same way as another supplier. So how do we handle that sort of delivery modality, if you will? How do we accommodate for different formats and standardize them into a common digital format within Tradeshift? And then last but not least, and this is really important, is a solution that provides ongoing training, enablement, self-service tools, and collaboration capabilities at every stage of that supplier's journey with Tradeshift. But it's not good enough for the supplier just to deliver an invoice, right? As our product roadmap comes to fruition and as we have new features and functionalities, alerting connected suppliers through Tradeshift of the new features, having there be video tutorials for those suppliers on what the new features mean, how to turn them on, how to use them, best practices, right? That's all part of a common, supplier digitization strategy to keep those suppliers sticky and constantly using the network to create value for themselves and their customers. So how specifically, and we'll get to the crux of the question that was posed, how does Tradeshift drive digital invoice adoption with all of this in mind? Frankly, by providing a fully digital, one connected experience. And we're going to talk for a minute about sort of Tradeshift network as the commonality, right? And then what does the supplier experience look like? And what does the buyer experience look like? Right. And at our core, it comes down to offering a digital network through which buyers and suppliers can connect with each other, transact with each other, and grow their businesses together and independently. Right. From a supplier standpoint, right, at the root level, right, it's about digitally sending invoices, right? But it doesn't stop there. Right. Suppliers get access to things like real-time invoice status, digital collaboration capabilities with connected customers, and a true global B2B network through which to extend their reach, right? Rowan mentioned during our introduction, right, we're not just e-invoicing and accounts payable, right? Suppliers who are on the network and connected can access B2B marketplaces. Perhaps they want a better facility to be able to sell their goods to their customers and other companies on the Tradeshift network, right? By connecting to things like existing B2B marketplaces, they have that facility to engage not just on the finance and AP side, but on the e-procurement side as well. And then obviously access to things like early payments through partnerships we have with HSBC. And from a buyer standpoint, on the other side of the network aisle, right, the ability to receive digital invoices, and here's the kicker, that are compliant, right? Tradeshift ensures that these invoices have mission critical data points and fields, and that they have necessary data required by local governments and tax authorities. If you're on the call, either from a partner or BPO or a potential customer, right? If you're an organization receiving invoices from global suppliers, you don't have a choice in terms of compliance. You need a compliance solution. If you're talking about changes in France and Poland and the way that Italy handles clearance mandates, right? So the impact and benefit of having a solution that offers compliance as part of this overall digitization strategy should definitely not be overlooked. Now, once invoices are received, right, enterprises can process them, approve them via Tradeshift if necessary, and then ultimately digitally send them to the ERP system, right? But along that path, buyers can continue to engage with their supply chain through things like digital collaboration capabilities to help resolve things like invoice discrepancies, delayed payments, and other related supplier inquiries. How do we make it easy for suppliers to deliver invoices via Tradeshift, right? I mentioned this and teased this earlier. It really comes down to the ability to offer flexible options for suppliers to deliver invoices and lower their barriers to entry, which is just absolutely critical in longer term sustained success with your project, right? The ability to handle paper and image PDFs, right? Understanding that, on day one, we won't be 100% digitally invoicing. And so there might still be some volume coming in that's paper or image PDF based. So it's critical to have an option for handling that, but combined and complemented with an strategic approach to transition those types of suppliers to more efficient delivery methods that are digital first in concept, right? Then providing low volume suppliers, right? Ones that are transacting very infrequently, but you still want to engage them digitally, giving them the ability to do things like creating an invoice directly in the user interface, right? As Tradeshift does. We also want to accommodate suppliers who are providing today what we call machine generated PDFs from an accounting system or an ERP system, right? We don't want suppliers to have to change anything about how they're sending you that invoice, right? All we're going to have them do is just change where they send it, change the email address, right? Tradeshift's going to map that machine generated PDF data to our structured format, which will allow that invoice to now exist in the network digitally for buyer review, two-way collaboration, and ultimate processing and eventual payment through the ERP system. And last but certainly not least, right, we want to engage your most strategic suppliers, right, that high volume population of suppliers through opportunities like structured formats, whether it's EDI connections, PEPL, different VANs, or direct integrations with those supplier ERP systems because of how often they're invoicing, right? So yes, what this is depicting is we're not a one-size-fits-all approach to invoice delivery. The goal is to accommodate suppliers of different shapes and sizes, standardize the data as it comes in, digitize it, and then here's where sort of the special sauce or the magic happens, right? Which is once the data comes in from your suppliers, how do we ensure that it's correct, it has the right data, and or it's compliant from a global, government entity or tax authority standpoint? And that is where our business firewall comes into play. And at its simplest core, the firewall ensures that the invoice is both globally compliant where necessary and adheres to any business-specific requirements, right? Going back to the whole focus on better data and analytics, cleaner invoices coming into the organization are going to create and result in more automated, opportunities for touchless straight-through processing, and ultimately better data for reporting and expedited payment, right? And TradeShift, once these invoices pass through this firewall, TradeShift is about more than just e-invoicing, right? We can add on things like AP workflow, document validation and enrichment, right? Exception handling, 2- and 3-way matching processes to then allow for more straight-through invoice processing, delivering those clean invoices to your ERP system. And while we're talking about ERP systems, we have some logos here in terms of the most common systems we typically see with our customer engagements. We are absolutely ERP agnostic. Certainly, we see quite a bit of SAP and Oracle in our engagements, but with an open API architecture and different options for middleware to connect system to system, we have no issue working and connecting with any other ERP system that's not displayed here on this slide.
Mike, I've got a
Yes,
question. This is my own
sure.
question. It's not from the audience, but maybe somebody asked this. So the business firewall is uh I don't know if it's unique to TradeShift. I imagine not entirely, but can you dial it up? Can you dial it down? Can you are there tolerances? How
It's
does that
such
work?
it's such a good segue. So whoever asked that question, I very much appreciate it. So you're right, right? I mean, your solutions are going to have opportunities to set rules, set tolerance levels. I think where TradeShift comes at this from a different perspective is helping organizations set the right balance, right? And what this slide is depicting here is the beauty and sometimes the challenge of having a flexible business firewall or rules engine or tolerance sort of machine, if you will, is you can do a lot with it, right? So on one extreme, right, if you're an organization and says, this is great, we're going to set up so many rules and so many restrictions so that we never get invoices that have incomplete data fields, a missing PO number, a missing person of reference on the invoice, and therefore our AP teams are going to love us because they're not going to have to deal with this. In theory, that's great for the buying organization, not so much for the suppliers, because what's going to happen is you're going to have too many rules in place, frankly, that are going to go outside of what most suppliers and their systems can actually deliver, right? And we talked a lot earlier on about low barriers for the suppliers to adoption for e-invoicing. This is not going to create low barriers, right? A supplier getting notified that, hey, your invoice didn't pass the smell test. Hey, your invoice didn't get through. Hey, correct this. Hey, correct that is not a good recipe for optimal supplier engagement. On the other side, right, if you're an organization that says, well, we want optimal supplier engagement, so let's not put any rules in place. Let's have it be the Wild West, right? What's going to happen there is every invoice will get through from your supplier, but then the onus is on the AP team to rifle through what I call non-strategic exceptions. This invoice is missing a PO number. This invoice is missing an invoice date. This invoice is missing a person of reference, right? Those aren't strategic to an organization, right? That's just taking time, right? So how does setting up a firewall achieve a balance where you get mutual benefit for your suppliers, right? Because they're getting majority of their invoices are passing the sniff test, but then some invoices aren't, and the suppliers are being notified as to what needs correction, right? So it's an educational tool as well. From a buyer standpoint, right, you're getting a good balance, right? You're getting, invoices coming in that are adhering to your business requirements, right? But you're also stopping some invoices that may really be out of whack, right? That may really, not have what you need the invoice to have. And you're continuing to educate the supply base on what those fields are so they can correct, reissue, and hopefully not, make that same, mistake moving forward. So, going back, kind of, wrapping this up in a nice bow, it's about how TradeShift approaches setting up these rules for our organizations to give as much value to both sides of the equation as possible, which again drives that stickiness, doesn't turn off the supplier to join that digitization project, and still gives value to the AP team because they won't be dealing with as many sort of tactical exceptions within their AP workflow. Now, beyond the invoice receipt and beyond the firewall, right? Once the invoices are sitting in the TradeShift network at the disposal of both buyer and supplier, right? Visibility is key. right? So once suppliers are connected to Tradeshift, it's all about delivering immediate value. And how do we do that? Well, it's not a special sauce necessarily, right? We've all heard the term supplier portal, supplier dashboard, right? Tradeshift provides a very easy to use supplier dashboard for connected suppliers, right? The ability to drill in, the first day that you're connected to the network, to drill into things like invoices, whether those invoices have been sent, accepted, paid, rejected, if they're overdue, right? If they're disputed, right? Where you might need to drill into the invoice and see the rationale behind why an invoice is still sitting out there unpaid, right? Giving the ability for the supplier to drill into other financial related documents, POs, credit notes, etc., for status updates in a self-service fashion, right? Providing through this dashboard things like self-guided enablement, training videos, documentation, best practices, FAQs, right? Through something we call Tradeshift University, again, is critical to the sustainability of the supplier experience, to keep them coming back and wanting to use Tradeshift over and over and over and over again. Right? Beyond the dashboard, right? We drill into those documents. What do suppliers and buyers have at their disposal? Well, they have integrated collaboration, right? So does a supplier have a question about an invoice or a document, right? They can drill into the document, open up a collaboration window, and invite the buyer to collaborate. Or if you're a buyer and you have a question about a document internally, maybe you need to ask procurement a question, maybe you need to ask a manager a question, you have the internal collaboration capabilities through the same facility, right? And the ability to store this conversation and document audit trail and document itself in one place creates reduced out-of-band supplier inquiries, right? We don't want that communication happening via email or phone call or voicemail, right? And more, in theory, more expedited invoice processing and payment, right? So it's all about visibility. It's all about transparency. So what does this all mean? Right? We've covered a lot. We've covered digitization strategy, why being supplier first is so critical for a long-term success. We've talked about giving suppliers flexibility to invoice, in the way that makes the most sense for them, while still allowing that invoice to be considered digital within Tradeshift, right? So what does this all mean? It's about what are the drivers for e-invoicing success. And as a quick recap here, it's about being supplier first, right? When you're investing in technology like a Tradeshift, right? Yes, you're making, a multi-year investment in e-invoicing and AP automation, but it can't just be an internal investment, right? It has to be something that gets exposed to your suppliers, the value propositions, the marketing, the messaging. It's critical to have the suppliers be on the journey with you. Additional value-added services for suppliers from the outset, right? We mentioned very early in the introduction, right? Not just giving suppliers the ability to submit an invoice, giving them the ability to have visibility into where that invoice sits, the ability to give them collaboration capabilities, the ability to give them opportunities to expand their use of the network through connecting to B2B marketplaces to sell goods and services and not just submit invoices. Giving flexible onboarding toolkits, right? We talked about numerous ways for suppliers to connect, right? Are they sending machine-generated PDFs? Are they still sending paper? Do they want a facility to create an invoice directly in the network? Are they super strategic and high volume where they're willing to integrate with a solution like Tradeshift, right? Giving a plethora of options means you're likely going to have a better, universe of suppliers that adopt this digital transformation project. Simplification, right? Simplify the process for the supplier to get onto the network and submit you an invoice, right? That's why we introduced the balance in that business firewall, including compliance requirements, right? The supplier should know that when they send an invoice, right, we have built-in compliance that's going to allow that invoice to go to the relevant tax authority or government entity. If there's a QR code that needs to be supplied on that invoice because of clearance requirements in a country like India, making sure that invoice comes back into Tradeshift with the relevant information, and labels on that invoice. And then here's something we haven't covered, and I don't want to gloss over it. Because these projects can't just be enterprise buyer focused, there has to be a willingness for the purchasing enterprise, right? The enterprise investing in this technology to have conversations with the supply base, educate them. Why did we decide to go with a company like TradeShift? What's in it for them? What value propositions exist for your suppliers? How can they invoice? What do the invoices look like? What does the UI look like? How can you collaborate with us? What KPIs are we marching towards? What return do you, supplier X, get out of our investment? And where necessary, putting in place some level of mandate in terms of asking the supplier to consider changing the way that they do business, right, with you, and why they should consider doing that. Because what may happen is you can purchase the best piece of technology on the market. I don't care if it's TradeShift or some other piece of technology that's out there in the market. If, as a buying organization, the one investing in the technology, if you're not willing to have these conversations with your supply base, then you're going to have a great piece of technology that you may love to use internally that won't be leveraged optimally by your supply chain, right? And that's the key to getting, an optimal situation going in invoicing and APs, to getting your supplier partners on that journey with you. So do not shy away from having these conversations with your supply base. And TradeShift comes to the table when we talk about implementation and strategy. We help you and complement the process of messaging to your supply base, focusing on what the value props are for them, having conversations with your suppliers, ensuring that they're going to get value out of using the solution. So we don't stay in the background when it comes to working with you collaboratively on getting, that kind of participation from your supply chain. Now, from a business ROI standpoint, right? Ardent Partners looked at, again, enterprises they surveyed last year and evaluated what ROIs are on the table for organizations that look for help with e-invoicing, help with AP automation solutions. You can potentially realize up to a 29% reduction of time spent within AP dealing with supplier inquiries. Why? Because you're now providing a supplier dashboard and supplier portal mechanism for suppliers to get their own visibility on where open invoices are, where payments are, and at the very least, be able to send a communication to a buying customer about, where in the process payment might be, or why an invoice is still open for approval, right? You're wiping away handling that through email boxes or through voicemails, et cetera. Ardent Partners considers best-in-class organizations are ones that spend 50% less in supplier data management processes. So being part of a network like TradeShift, where buying and supplying parties have business profiles on the network, which allows them to create their profiles with necessary supplier information. Both parties can update information within those supplier profiles so that data management becomes, an easier process than it is today. And Ardent Partners also clarifies that best-in-class organizations are 152% more likely to use a supplier portal, right? And this just goes back to the value proposition we've been laying out from the beginning of this presentation around, if you act in a supplier-first approach to these projects, right, you're going to get the KPIs, you're going to get the return on investment, because suppliers are going to buy in. They're going to check the portal. They're going to submit invoices through it. They're going to look at invoice statuses. They're going to look at payment statuses, right? We're capturing remittance data from the ERP, serving it up through TradeShift. So if there's a question on the payment details, the suppliers have it in that centralized network as well, right? So, our goal is to help our customers get to be best-in-class organizations according to partners like Ardent Partners. Leave behinds, right? We've covered a lot in about 45 minutes or so. So what do Rowan and I want to leave behind with the participants in terms of themes or morals to the story here? And we're going to be pretty blunt, right, with everybody here. Downstream processes are going to continue to lag until things like e-invoicing, digital invoicing, and compliance are fully embraced and encouraged, right? Things like better straight-through processing, better analytics, better matching capabilities, leveraging AI. All of those things are nice in practice, but they can't be done optimally if invoices are still coming in through broken channels, decentralized ways, and destandardized in ways that are not standardized, right?
Hey, Mike, let me jump in.
Yeah,
I've
absolutely.
actually got a bunch of questions, but I'm gonna wait till you finish. But just on that bullet there, so we started the conversation by talking about churn, and and the ultimate goal is, of course, digital transformation with as much automation as possible. Ideally, suppliers that are digitally connected, but there's always churn. Even if you're the best in class in a very secure buyer supplier ecosystem, there's churn. So I was just wondering if you had a thought to addressing churn. So you've always got 10% of your suppliers coming in. You know, what's the process of making sure that you're as, let's say, as digitally connected as possible from the get-go? It's not just a one-off project, right? You know?
Correct. I mean, I think, in terms of churn, I think what we've been laying out here throughout the 45 minutes is, if as an organization you have a more digital first infrastructure in place, right, like a trade shift network, where as your suppliers might be changing, or you get new suppliers into the fold, right, being able to turn on, a supplier account in a network, being able to serve up, transactions and information really on day one for the supplier who's coming into your business, right? Once they've been sort of formally onboarded by your organization, right? The ability to say to them, here's how we best engage with our supply base. Here are tools at your disposal to learn why we've engaged in this digital transformation project. Here is Tradeshift University to help you sort of in a self-service fashion get up and running with how to submit invoices, how to create inquiries, how to use collaboration. Having that infrastructure does make it easier to handle the supplier churn, right? Because the goal is to not transact in a one-off fashion with each and every one of your suppliers, right? The goal is, while providing flexibility in terms of how they deliver the invoice, the goal is to, centralize the information in one place. And so from my perspective, having that infrastructure in place, even though churn, as we laid out earlier in the presentation, even though churn, is a problem now and likely will continue to be within supply chains, having a digital infrastructure in place is only going to help with onboarding new suppliers, with getting new suppliers up and running with your best practices. And because Tradeshift is coming to the table with help when it comes to marketing to suppliers, promoting the digital value prop to these suppliers, my suspicion is getting those suppliers onboarded and up and running will be much easier by having that infrastructure already in place.
Of course.
And while we're talking about, supplier connection, it's focus across the aisle, right? Extend the olive branch to the suppliers, right? Improving supplier value through this project or through this transformation initiative and improving e-invoicing rates are undoubtedly going to lead to better invoice straight-through processing metrics and fewer supplier inquiries. And last but certainly not least, do not expect clean data out of this process for reporting analytics if invoices coming in are not clean or are incomplete or are destandardized, right? Use business rules, right? The business firewall we laid out with Tradeshift 10 or so minutes ago, right? Use business rules to ensure accurate invoicing, right? So that invoice exception handling, matching, reporting, and analytics efforts are more efficient downstream. We've all heard the phrase garbage in, garbage out, right? There's no way that from an analytics and reporting and dashboarding standpoint, that your financial leadership team will get what they need out of an e-invoicing or AP automation solution if the data coming in at the start of that process is bad, right? So hyper focus on, allowing the flexibility for the suppliers to submit the way that best works for them, but at the same time, having a solution that can standardize those different delivery methods into a digital first format so that the data coming out in terms of reporting and analytics is clean and optimal for accurate reporting for leadership teams, for boards of directors, for investors, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll take a pause. That is all I had for the
Sounds
webinar
good, Mike.
today. I'll hand it back to Rowan, see if there's any.
Yeah, I've collected some questions here. And we probably won't get to all of them, but so whose responsibility is it to onboard suppliers, procurement or AP?
It's really a topic that we hear about a lot, and the term onboarding can mean different things to different organizations, right? When I think of onboarding, I think of, I've never worked with a supplier before. There's a process internally that we have to go through to get that supplier into our purview, whether it's legal documents, tax forms, setting them up in the ERP, et cetera. That process still would remain sort of how that process is driven today in your organization. It might be a combination of procurement and finance, right? If it's a supplier that procurement is looking to purchase from, I suspect that process would be initiated through procurement, and then finance would then collect the necessary forms, whether it's tax or legal forms, to get that supplier set up in your ERP system. Where Tradeshift then gets involved, once that supplier is set up in the ERP system, because we have a direct feed from that ERP system, we would set that supplier up as an account in Tradeshift, right? And then we could campaign, we could message to that supplier to, again, provide the value props, help them understand what Tradeshift is, why your organization is using Tradeshift for e-invoicing and potentially AP automation, and then giving them access to what delivery methods are ripe for participating in Tradeshift, right? And my guess is that those suppliers will already be sending invoices in a way that Tradeshift can accommodate. Most likely, we see the majority of suppliers are sending invoices out of their accounting or ERP systems. So we absolutely, accommodate that sort of electronic PDF and map that data so that it can be inside of Tradeshift digitally. So from an onboarding standpoint, you still keep the onboarding process sort of as is between procurement and finance. And then as those suppliers exist in your ERP and you want to start transacting with them via Tradeshift, Tradeshift would get involved in helping to push that initiative, with your internal teams as well.
Sure, makes sense. I mean, I've seen like, for example, when we've sold an AP automation solution, often there's a big initiative there to onboard suppliers simply for the purpose of sending e-invoices. But then for subsequent suppliers for that churn that we've talked about, procurement would have sort of an element of their terms and conditions that would relate to how to send invoices to us. So that's kind of your basic best practice. All right, I got another one. Can suppliers who are on other business networks send invoices to Tradeshift customers?
Absolutely. There's no hard and fast rule that if a supplier is, participating on something like the Ariba network, right, that they can't also use the Tradeshift network, right? Obviously, if there's customers of that supplier who are very strategic to that supplier, and that buying organization is a Tradeshift customer, right? There's no problem with inviting that supplier to be part of the Tradeshift network. I think suppliers today understand that there are, frankly, there are a number of good solutions in the market, right, that allow suppliers to invoice their customers, right? So I think it's a cost of doing business for a supplier to use multiple solutions, and I don't think that's ever going away.
Right.
Our goal as a technology company is to encourage and position Tradeshift as a solution that should get closer looks from suppliers, where because we're a true network, a supplier may find that more and more and more of their customers are connected to Tradeshift. And so by participating across our network from a supplier standpoint, they'll be able to reach many of their customers through a single login because we're a true multi-enterprise network, right? So it's probably never going to mean that the supplier is never going to use another business network, but
Sure.
it may mean that the supplier notices that more and more and more and more of their customers are on our network because of the extended value we provide, not just in e-invoicing and AP, but in B2B marketplaces, embedded fintech, and areas like those.
All right. Next one. When a supplier uses the chat function, uh, who do they chat with? Where's the chat going?
The chat's really going to go with whoever owns the invoice receipt from the buying standpoint, right? So if it's, the person of reference on the invoice is, an end user, an AP or an AP manager, right? Initially, that conversation will be between the supplier and that particular individual. But the beauty of the collaboration within TradeShift is it's not single threaded, right? So both on the supplier side and on the buyer side, there's the ability to invite additional participants into that conversation. So if I'm Michael, AP user, right, and a supplier poses me a supplier inquiry and I can't answer the question, right, I can go to my collaboration, I can invite Rowan to the conversation, and now I have 3 people engaged,
Hmm.
right? I don't have to forward an email, right? I now have a single threaded conversation digitally stored against the digital invoices, against the audit trail, where now I have myself, Rowan, and the supplier involved, right? And ideally, Rowan can help answer the question that the supplier poses. And both parties at a later date can come back into TradeShift from an auditing perspective, see the conversation. Oh, yeah, I remember, there was an issue around that invoice. We resolved it amongst the 3 of us. I don't have to reach out independently via email and ask the buying organization for, why this invoice was short paid or why we have a credit note or why it was rejected. So that collaboration is, superbly fluid when it comes to who can be part of it, how many people can be engaged, right? And we never want an invoice or a collaboration, a string to sort of sit in a black hole, right? Too often, those kind of processes and those kind of communications can go unanswered, not purposely, but just because someone marks something red in their email and never sees it again, right?
Sure.
There's reminders built in, there's messaging built in, there's email notifications, not just in-system notifications. So we make sure that those communications don't hit the AP black hole, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, this is probably the last question. There's a few more. We're going to reply to them by email, but last question here. And this is, in your experience, is there a best practice way of dealing with suppliers who either send partial invoices or consolidated invoices when you onboard them to e-invoicing?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be different.
I should also just say, this is my own. Does it matter? Doesn't, no, sorry, the question wasn't my own, but my input is, does it even matter when we're talking about e-invoicing? Does it negate the one's better than the other?
There's always going to be nuanced ways that suppliers prepare their invoices, whether it's a supplier that sends like a bulk PDF, which has, multiple or dozens of invoices, right? JHF has the capacity to take those types of situations through our sort of email PDF approach and extrapolate, what constitutes the end of one invoice and the start of another invoice, right? So there are ways to, again, this goes back to trying to, provide low barrier to entry for the suppliers. If they're used to sending you bulk invoices, they can continue to send bulk invoices, and we can ensure that TradeShift is set up to accommodate sort of splitting out, okay, here's the end of that invoice, turn that into a digital invoice. Here's the end of the next invoice, turn that into a digital invoice, right? And also store the original PDF against that digital copy within TradeShift. So, I think ideally, if a supplier has a very nuanced or unique way of invoicing you, there's always opportunities in these digital transformation projects to revisit why that's required,
Sure.
why the supplier has to invoice you this way. And I don't mean what format, I just mean if there's something really unique and probably not value add about the way they invoice, I think this is a really great opportunity to, um, if not change it, at the very least have a conversation about invoicing best practices. And that
Awesome.
comes
Mike,
from, yeah,
I'm gonna cut you off.
no problem.
Hey, I just want, only because I want to say thank you to everyone who attended this call. Thank you, Michael, for giving us the benefit of your expertise on this subject. Super interesting. Again, we will answer your questions by email directly, those whose questions we didn't get to. So thanks again, Michael. Appreciate your time. And
You're
thank you
welcome. Thank you,
for
Rowan, and
taking
thank you,
time.
participants.
Yes.